Good evening, everyone. How are you today? Day Lady here. Sharon Schultz is my name, and I am going to be reading to you a book, um, a mystery book from a very old, iconic series. Um, we're we're several chapters in. Actually, we're close to the end. I think two more evenings will finish the book. So, if you are just now joining me, there are videos of the previous chapters on my Facebook page, Sharon Schultz, and also on my YouTube channel, Sharon Schultz, the Bay Lady. So either one of those will get you the rest of the chapters in the book. But before we get to that, um, those that don't know me, you probably would want to follow me on Facebook and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. I have a lot of different tours. They call me the Bay Lady because my area of expertise would be the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. It's a huge, beautiful bay, the biggest on the coast. It has a lot of different landscapes associated with it, some really cool places. It's just beautiful here. So that is what I generally do. I do virtual tours um, on these networks, on these platforms. So um, it's winter, it's cold. So I've suspended virtual tours for the time being and came up with Nancy Drew. I've done this once before, so figured we'd try it again. Um, so all of my tours, the virtual tours, and of course these are all tip funded. Okay. And I do have a platform that you'll find on my Facebook page and on my YouTube channel that is called buymeacoffee.com. And if you go there, if you like what you see, you want to contribute, usually it's important when I'm doing the live tours outside or wherever it is that I'm going, because sometimes it involves, gas for the car, admission fees for the event, and stuff like that. So I don't make a lot of money here. I just cover my expenses doing what I enjoy doing. So, not a bad deal. Okay. Books. Nancy Drew Nancy Drew Mystery Stories are iconic set of mystery books that were very popular in the 20th century, early to, well, probably late 20th century. There are many books. I couldn't even tell you how many. The first one was published in 1930. It's a series of books, and it is written by one person. Her name is Carolyn Keene. Some of the later books in the series, however, were written using her name, but she wasn't doing the writing by them. I guess it was a some type of franchise thing, not sure. But anyway, so these books were really, really popular back in the day. And so they're written from 1930s, 1940s perspective. Okay. The world was a much quieter, simpler place back in the early to mid 20th century. And these books definitely reflect it. So we are on number 2 in this series. We read the first book, which was The Secret of the Old Clock. Now we're on book number 2. Okay, and we're going to take up where we left off. This will be chapter 13, The Crash. Okay, let me just get myself my Nancy Drew books. Nancy Drew wasn't the only mystery genre out there. We've got Trixie Belden. Okay, I've got 3 of her. Yeah, there's 3 Trixie Belden. She was a mystery girl. Trixie Belden, the what does it say? The Gatehouse Mystery is one. Also by Carolyn Keene was another set of books called The Dana Girls. And they are right here very similar to this style of book. They look like this, but they're not yellow, they're beige. And they're about sisters who are crime solvers. And again, we're talking about the same period of time. Another, Carrie Ames. Okay. She was a nurse who solved mysteries. Okay. This is the first 4 in her set. And so it's Carrie Ames, student nurse, senior nurse, army nurse, chief nurse. Okay. And then, of course, there's the Bobbsey twins. Those were the books that probably most young kids started with and worked their way up to the others. To be fair, in addition to Nancy Drew books for the girls, the Hardy Boys were the male version of that. There were, mysteries like crazy. And the thing was, I think the Hardy Boys came about a little bit later, but they were actually featured on Walt Disney first had the Hardy Boys on The Wonderful World of Color, his Disney show. So that was kind of interesting. And also the Hardy Boys were regulars on the Mickey Mouse Club, if anybody remembers that. It's all around the same time here. Anyway, okay, here we go. Chapter 13, The Crash. The stranger inspecting Nancy's car must have heard her coming. Without turning around, he dodged back of the automobile and started off across the field in the opposite direction. He certainly acts suspiciously. He must be the man with the crinkly car who helped abduct my father, Nancy thought excitedly. Quickly, she crossed the road and ran after him as fast as she could, hoping to overtake him. But the man had had a good head start. Also, his stride was longer than Nancy's, and he could cover more ground in the same amount of time. The far corner of the irregular shaped field ended at the road on which Riverview Manor stood. When Nancy reached the when Nancy reached the highway, she was just in time to see the stranger leap into a parked car and drive off. The young detective was exasperated. She had had only a glimpse of the man's profile. If only she could have seen him full face or caught the license number of his car. I wonder if he's the one who dropped the newspaper, she asked herself. Maybe he's from River Heights. She surmised that the man himself was not one of the property owners, but he might have been hired by Willie Wharton or one of the owners to help abduct Mr. Drew. I'd better hurry to a phone and report this, Nancy thought. She ran all the way back across the field, stepped into her own car, turned it around, and headed for Twin Elms. When Nancy arrived, she sped to the telephone in the hall and dialed Cliffwood Police Headquarters. In a moment, she was talking to the captain and gave him her latest information. It certainly looks as if you picked up a good clue, Miss Drew, the officer remarked. I'll send out an alarm immediately to have this man picked up. I suppose there's no news of my father, Nancy said. I'm afraid not, but a couple of our men talked to the taxi driver, Harry, and he gave us a pretty good description of the man who came along the road while your father was lying unconscious on the grass, the one who offered to take him to the hospital. What did he look like? Nancy asked. The officer described the man as being in his early 50s, short and rather heavy set. He had shifty, pale blue eyes. Well, Nancy replied, I can think of several men who would fit that description. Did he have any outstanding characteristics? Harry didn't notice anything except that the fellow's hands didn't look as if he did any kind of physical work. The taxman said they were kind of soft and pudgy. Well, that includes all the men I know who are short, heavy set, and have pale blue eyes. None of them has hands like that. It'll be a good identifying feature, the police officer remarked. Well, I guess I'd better get that alarm out. Nancy said goodbye and put down the phone. She waited several seconds for the line to clear, then picked up the instrument again and called Hannah Gruen. Before Nancy lay the sheet of newspaper from which the advertisement had been torn. The Drew resident said a voice on the phone. Hello, Hannah, this is Nancy. How are you, dear? Any news? Miss Gruen asked quickly. I haven't found Dad yet, the young detective replied, and the police haven't either. But I've picked up a couple of clues. Tell me about them, the housekeeper requested excitedly. Nancy told her about the man with the crinkly ear and said she was sure that the police would soon capture him. If only he'll talk, we may find out where Dad is being held. Oh, I hope so, Hannah sighed. Don't get discouraged, Nancy. At this point, Helen came into the hall, and as she passed Nancy on her way to the stairs, smiled at her friend. The young sleuth was about to ask Hannah to get the Drews' Tuesday copy of the River Heights Gazette when she heard a cracking noise overhead. Immediately, she decided the ghost might be at work again. Hannah, I'll call you back later, Nancy said, and put the phone down. She had no sooner done this than Helen screamed, Nancy, run! The ceiling! She herself started for the front door. Nancy looked up, saw a tremendous crack in the ceiling just above the girls' heads. The next instant, the whole ceiling crashed down on them. They were thrown to the floor. Oh, Helen moaned. She was covered with plaster and had been hit hard on the head, but she managed to call out from under the debris. Nancy, are you all right? There was no answer. The tremendous noise had brought Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary on a run from the kitchen. They stared in horror at the scene before them. Nancy lay unconscious, and Helen seemed too dazed to move. Oh my, Miss Flora exclaimed. She and Aunt Rosemary began stepping over the plaster, which by now had filled the air with dust. They sneezed again and again, but made their way forward nonetheless. Miss Flora, reaching Helen's side, started pulling aside chunks of broken plaster. Finally, she helped her great-granddaughter to her feet. Oh, my dear, you're hurt, she said solicitously. I'll be all right in a minute, Hannah insisted, choking with the dust. But Nancy, Aunt Rosemary, had already reached the unconscious girl. With lightning speed, she threw aside the debris which almost covered Nancy. Whipping a handkerchief from her pocket, she gently laid it over Nancy's face so that she would not breathe in any more of the dust. Helen, do you feel strong enough to help me carry Nancy into the library? She asked. I'd like to lay her on the couch there. Oh, yes, Aunt Rosemary. Do you think Nancy is badly hurt? She asked worriedly. I hope not. At this moment, Nancy stirred. Then her arm moved upward and she pulled the handkerchief from her face. She blinked several times as if unable to recall where she was. Excuse me. You'll be all right, Nancy, said Aunt Rosemary kindly. But I don't want you to breathe this dust. Please keep the handkerchief over your nose. She took it from Nancy's hand and once more laid it across the girl's nostrils and neck. In a moment, Nancy smiled wanly. I remember now, the ceiling fell down. Yes, said Helen. It knocked you out for a few minutes. I hope you're not hurt. Miss Flora, who was sneezing violently, insisted that they all get out of the dust at once. She began stepping across the piles of debris with Helen helping her. When they reached the little library door, the elderly woman went inside. Helen returned to help Nancy. But by this time, her friend was standing up and leaning on Aunt Rosemary's arm. She was able to make her way across the hall to the library. Aunt Rosemary suggested calling a doctor, but Nancy said that would not be necessary. I'm so thankful you girls weren't seriously hurt, Miss Flora said. What a dreadful thing this is. Do you think the ghost is responsible? Her daughter replied at once, No, I don't, Mother. You will recall that for some time we've had a leak in the hall whenever it rained. And the last time we had a storm, the whole ceiling was soaked. I think that weakened the plaster and it fell of its own accord. Miss Flora remarked that a new ceiling would be a heavy expense for them. Oh dear, more troubles all the time. But I still don't want to part with my home. Nancy, whose faculties by now were completely restored, said with a hint of a smile, Oh dear, more troubles all the time. But I still don't, sorry. Well, there's one more one worry you might not have anymore, Miss Flora. What's that? Mr. Gomber, said Nancy, may not be so interested in buying this property when he sees what happened. Oh, I don't know, Aunt Rosemary spoke up. He's pretty persistent. Nancy said she felt all right now and suggested that she and Helen start cleaning up the hall. Miss Flora would not hear this. Rosemary and I are going to help, she said determinedly. Cartons were brought from the cellar, and one after the other was filled with the debris. After it had all been carried outdoors, mops and dust cloths were brought into use. Within an hour, all the gritty plaster dust had been removed. The weary workers had just finished their job when the telephone rang. Nancy, being closest to the instrument, answered it. Hannah Gruen was calling. Nancy, what happened? She asked. I've been waiting over an hour for you to call me back. What's the matter? Nancy gave her all the details. What's going to happen to you next? The housekeeper exclaimed. The young sleuth laughed. Something good, I hope. She asked Hannah to look for her copy of the River Heights Gazette of the Tuesday before. In a few minutes, the housekeeper brought it to the phone, and Nancy asked her to turn to page 14. That has the classified ad, she said. Now tell me what the ad in the Now tell me what the ad is right in the center of the page. Do you mean the one about used cars? That must be it, Nancy replied. That's not in my paper. Hannah Gruen said it was an ad for Aikens, a used car dealer. He's at 24 Main Street in Hancock. And now, turn the page and tell me what ad is on the back of it, Nancy requested. It's a story about a school picnic, Hannah said. Does either of them help you? Yes, Hannah, I believe you've given me just the information I wanted. This may prove to be valuable. Thanks a lot. After Nancy had finished the call, she started to dial the police headquarters, but then changed her mind. The ghost might be hiding somewhere in the house to listen, as if he had installed microphones at various points. Any conversations could be picked up and recorded on a machine a distance away. It would be wiser for me to discuss the whole matter in person with the police, I'm sure, Nancy decided. Divulging her destination only to Helen, she told the others she was going to drive downtown, but would not be gone that long. You're sure you feel able? Aunt Rosemary asked her. I'm perfectly fine, Nancy insisted. She set off in the convertible, hopeful that through the clue of the used car dealer, the police might be able to pick up the name of one of the suspects. They can trace him and through the man locate my father. Chapter 16. Sorry. Where were we? chapter 13, right? Let's see. Okay, 13. Okay, so we're doing 13, 14, and 15. Okay. Chapter 14, an urgent message. Excellent, Captain Rosalind said after Nancy had told her story. He smiled. The way you've been building up clues, if you were on my force, I'd recommend a citation for you. The young sleuth smiled and thanked him. I must find my brother and my father, she said earnestly. I'll call Captain McGinnis of the River Heights force at once, the officer told her. Why don't you sit down here and wait? It shouldn't take long for them to get information from Aiken's used car lot. Nancy agreed and took a chair in a corner of the captain's office. Presently, he called to her. I have your answer, Miss Drew. She jumped up and went over to his desk. The officer told her that Captain McGinnis in River Heights had been most cooperative. He had sent two men at once to Aiken's used car lot. They had just returned with a report. Day before yesterday, an athletic looking man with a crinkly ear came here and purchased a car. It showed he showed a driver's license stating that he was Samuel Greenman from Huntsville. Nancy was excited over the information. Then it will be easy to pick him up, won't it? The girl asked. I'm afraid not, Captain Rosalind replied. McGinnis learned from the Huntsville police that although Greenman is supposed to live at the address he gave, he is reported to have been out of town for some time. Then no one knows where he is? Not any of his neighbors know. The officer also reported that Samuel Greenman was a person of questionable character. He was wanted on a couple of robbery charges, and police in several states had been alerted to be on the lookout for him. Well, if the man I saw at my car is Samuel Greenman, then maybe he's hiding in this area. Captain Rosalind smiled. Are you going to suggest next that he is the ghost at Twin Elma? Who knows? Nancy countered. In any case, Captain Rosalind said, your idea that he may be hiding out around here is a good one. Nancy was about to ask the officer another question when his phone rang. A moment later, he said, it's for you, Miss Drew. The girl detective picked up the receiver and said hello. The caller was Helen Corning, and her voice sounded frantic. Oh, Nancy, something dreadful has happened here. You must come at once. What is it? Nancy cried out, but Helen had already put down the instrument at her end. Nancy told Captain Rosalind of the urgent request and said she must leave at once. Let me know if you need the police, the officer called after her. Thank you, I will. Nancy drove to Twin Elms. as fast as the law allowed. As she pulled up in front of the house, she was startled to see a doctor's car there. Someone had been taken ill. Helen met her friend at the front door. Nancy, she said in a whisper, Miss Flora may not, Miss Flora may have had a heart attack. How terrible, Nancy said, shocked. Tell me all about it. Miss Dr. Morrison wants Miss Flora to get to the hospital right away, but she refuses. She says she won't leave here. Helen said that the physician was still upstairs attending her great grandmother. When did she become ill? Nancy asked. Did something in particular bring on the attack? Helen nodded. Yes, it was very frightening, Miss Flora. Aunt Rosemary and I were in the kitchen talking about supper. They wanted to have a special dish to surprise you because they knew you were dreadfully upset. That was sweet of them, Nancy remarked. Please go on, Helen. Miss Flora became rather tired, and Aunt Rosemary suggested that she go upstairs and lie down. She had just started up the stairs when, for some unknown reason, she turned to look back. There in the parlor stood a man. A caller? Nancy questioned. Oh no, Helen replied. Miss Flora said he was so ugly, a horrible looking person. He was unshaven and his hair was kind of long. Do you think he was the ghost? Nancy inquired. Miss Flora thought so. Well, she hadn't, she didn't scream anyway. You know, she's really terribly brave, and she just decided to go down and meet him herself. And then, what do you think? I could guess any number of things, Nancy replied. What did happen? Helen said that when Mrs. Turnbull had reached the parlor, no one was in it, and there was no secret door open. What does Miss Flora do then? Nancy asked. She fainted. At this moment, a tall, slender, gray haired man carrying a physician's bag walked down the stairs to the front hall. Helen introduced Nancy to him, then asked about the patient. Well, fortunately, Miss Flora is going to be all right, said Dr. Morrison. She is an amazing woman with complete rest and nothing more to worry her. I believe she'll be all right. In fact, she may be able to be up for short periods by this time tomorrow. Oh, I'm so relieved, said Helen. I'm terribly fond of my great grandmother, and I don't want anything to happen to her. The physician smiled. I'll do all I can, but you people will have to help me. How can we do that? Nancy asked quickly. The physician said that among no one was to talk about the ghost. Miss Flora said that she saw a man in the parlor and that he must have come in by some secret entrance. Now, you know as well as I do that such a thing is not possible. But the man couldn't have entered the house under any other way, Helen told him. Every window and door on this first floor is kept locked. The doctor raised his eyebrows. You've heard of hallucinations? He asked. Nancy and Helen frowned, but remained silent. They were sure that Miss Flora had not had an hallucination. If she had said there was a man in the parlor, then one had been there, if she said so. Call me if you need me before tomorrow morning, the doctor said as he moved toward the front door. Otherwise, I'll drop in some time before 12. After the medic had left, the two girls exchanged glances. Nancy said, Are you game to search the parlor again? Yeah, but I am, Helen replied. Shall we start now or wait till after supper? Although Nancy was eager to begin at once, she thought that first she would go upstairs and extend her sympathy to Miss Flora. She also felt that a delay in serving her supper while the search went on might upset the ill woman. Helen offered to go into the kitchen at once and start preparing the meal. Nancy nodded and went up the steps. Miss Flora had been put to bed in her daughter's room to avoid any further scares from the ghost, who seemed to operate in the elderly woman's own rooms. Miss Flora, I'm so sorry you have to stay in bed, said Nancy, walking up and smiling at the patient. Well, I am too, Miss Turnbull smiled. And I think it's a lot of nonsense than anything else. I think there's probably fake pieces on the bottom. Everybody faints once in a while. If you'd ever seen what I did, that horrible face. Mother, pleaded Aunt Rosemary, who was seated in a chair on the other side of the bed. You know what the doctor said. Oh, these doctors, her mother said, peevish, her mother said. Anyway, Nancy, I'm sure I saw the ghost. Now, you just look for a man who hasn't shaved in goodness knows how long and has an ugly face and kind of longish hair. It was on the tip of Nancy's tongue to ask for information on the man's height and size, but recalling the doctor's warning, she said nothing about this. Instead, she smiled and, taking one of Miss Flora's hands in her own, said, Let's not talk any more about this until you're up and well. Then I'll put you on the Drew and Company Detective Squad. Mm. The amazing remark made the elderly woman smile, and she promised to try getting some rest. But first, I want something to eat, she demanded. Do you think you girls can manage alone? I'd like Rosemary to stay here with me tonight. Then, of course, we can imagine and we'll bring you exactly what you should have to eat. Nancy went downstairs and set up a tray for Miss Flora. On it was a cup of steaming chicken bouillon, a thin slice of well toasted butter, and a saucer of plain gelatin. A few minutes later, Hannah took the uh, Hannah Helen took another tray upstairs with a more substantial meal on it for Aunt Rosemary. Then the two girls sat down in the dining room to have their own supper. After finishing it, they quickly washed and dried all the dishes, then started for the parlor. Where do you think we should look? Helen whispered. During the past half hour, Nancy had been going over in her mind what spot in the parlor they might have overlooked. One which could possibly have an opening behind it. She had decided on a large cabinet built into the wall. It contained a beautiful collection of figurines, souvenirs from many places, and knickknacks of various kinds. I'm going to look for a hidden spring that may move the cabinet away from the wall, Nancy told Helen in a low voice. For the first time, she noticed that each of the figurines and knickknacks were set in small depressions on the shelves. Nancy wondered excitedly if this had been done so that the figurines would not fall over in case the cabinet were moved. Eagerly, she began to look on the back wall of the interior of the cabin for a spring cleaning. She and Helen together searched every inch of the garage, every inch of the upper part, but found no spring to move the great built-in of furniture. On the lower part of the cabinet were two doors, which Nancy had already opened many times, but then she had been looking for a large opening. Now she was hoping to locate a tiny spring on a movable panel. Helen searched the left side while Nancy took the right. Suddenly, her pulse quickened in anticipation. She felt a spot slightly higher than the rest. Nancy ran her fingers back and forth across the area, which was about half an inch high and 3 inches long. It may conceal something, she thought, and pushed gently against the wood. Nancy felt a vibration in the whole cabinet of felt a vibration in the whole cabinet. Helen, I found something, she whispered. Better stand back. Hmm. Nellie, Nancy pressed harder. This time, the right side of the cabinet begins to move forward. Nancy jumped up from her knees and stood back with Helen. Slowly, very slowly, one end of the cabinet began to move into the parlor, the other into an open space behind it. Helen grabbed Nancy's hand in fright. What were they going to find in the secret passageway? Chapter 15. A New Suspect. The great crystal chandelier illuminated the narrow passageway behind the cabinet. It was not very long. No one was in it, and the place was dusty and filled with cobwebs. There's probably an exit at the other end of this, Nancy said. Let's see where it goes. I think I'd better wait here, Nancy, Helen suggested. This old cabinet might suddenly start to close itself. If it does, I'll yell so you can get out in time. Nancy laughed. You're a real pal, Helen. As Nancy walked along the passageway, she looked carefully at the two walls which lined it. There were no visible exits from either of the solid plastered walls. The far end, too, was solid, but this wall had been built of wood. Nancy felt it might have some significance. At the moment, she could not figure it out and started to return to the parlor. Halfway along the narrow corridor, she saw a folded piece of paper lying on the floor. This may prove something, she told herself eagerly, picking it up. Just as Nancy stepped back into the parlor, Aunt Rosemary appeared. She stared in astonishment at the opening in the wall and at the cabinet, which now stood at right angles to it. You found something? She asked. Only this, Nancy replied, and handed Aunt Rosemary the folded paper. As the girls looked over her shoulders, Mrs. Hayes reread it. This is an unfinished letter, she commanded, then started to write with, and then started to decipher the old-fashioned handwriting. Why, this was written way back in 1785, not long after the house was built. The note read, My honorable friend Benjamin. The disloyalty of two of my servants has just come to my attention. I am afraid they plan to harm the cause of the colonies. I will have them properly punished. My good fortune in learning about this disloyalty came when I was at my living room, living, when I was at my listening post. Every word spoken in the servants' sitting room can be overheard by me. I will watch for further I will watch for further. Oh, that's how he closed the letter. The letter ended at this point. Instantly, Helen said, "Listening post." "It must be at the end of this passageway," Nancy guessed. "Aunt Rosemary, what room would connect with it?" "I presume the kitchen," Mrs. Hayes replied. "And it seems to me that I once heard that the present kitchen was a sitting room for the servants long ago. You recall that back in colonial days, food was never cooked in a mansion. It was always prepared in another building and brought in on great trays." Helen smiled. "With a listening post, the poor servants here didn't have a chance for a good chit chat together. Their conversations were never a secret from their matters." Nancy and Aunt Rosemary smiled up and nodded. Then the young sleuth said, "Let's see if this listening post still works." It was arranged that Helen would go into the kitchen and start talking. Nancy would stand at the edge of the kitchen table. There's no, with no, I can't find it. Blah, blah, blah. What was arranged? Okay, would act as guard if the great piece of furniture suddenly started to move and close the opening. "Already," Helen asked. She moved out of the room. When she thought Nancy was at her post, Helen began to talk about her forthcoming wedding and asked Nancy to be in the bridal party. "I can hear Helen very plainly," Nancy called excitedly to Aunt Rosemary. "The listening post is as good as ever." When the test was over and the cabinet manually closed by Nancy, she and Helen and Aunt Rosemary held a whispered conversation. They all decided that the ghost knew about the passageway and had overheard plans which those in the house were making. Probably this was where the ghost disappeared after Miss Flora had spotted him. Funny that we seem to do more planting while we're in the kitchen than in any color room, said Aunt Mary. Helen said she wondered if this listening post was unique with the disease of the Twin Elms mansion curse. "No, indeed," Aunt Rosemary told her. "Many old homes where there were servants had places like this. Don't forget that our country has been involved in several wars during which traitors and spies find it easy to get information while posting as servants." "Very clever," Helen remarked. "And I suppose a lot of people who were caught never knew they had been found out." "No doubt," said Aunt Rosemary. At that moment, they heard Miss Flora's feeble, feeble voice calling from the bedroom and hurried up to see if she was all right. They found her smiling, but she complained that she did not like to stay alone so long. "I won't leave you again tonight, Mother," Aunt Rosemary promised. "I'm going to sleep on the couch in this little room so as not to disturb you." Now try to get a little sleep. The following morning, Nancy had a phone call from Hannah Gruen, whose voice sounded very irate. I've just heard from Mr. Barsdale, the railroad lawyer. He lost your address and phone number, so he called here. I'm furious at what he had to say. He hinted that your father might be staying away on purpose because he wasn't able to produce Willie Wharton. Why, that's absolutely unfair and untrue, she cried. Well, I just wouldn't stand for it if I were you, Hannah Gruen said flatly. And that's only half of it. You mean he had more to say about it, Dad? Nancy questioned him. No, not that, the housekeeper answered. He was calling to say that the railroad can't hold up the bridge project any longer. If some new evidence wasn't produced by Monday, the railroad would be forced to acquiesce to the demands of Willie Wharton and all those other property owners. Oh, that would be a great blow to Dad, said Nancy. He wouldn't want this to happen. He's sure that the signature on the contract of sale is Willie Wharton's. All he had to do was find him and prove it. Everything is such a mess. Okay. Everything is such a mess, said Mrs. Gruen. I was talking to the police just before I called you, and they have no leads at all as to where your father might be. Hannah, this is dreadful, said Nancy. I don't know how, but I intend to find Dad. Long ago, Mr. Drew had taught Nancy that the best way to clear one's brain is to communicate with nature for a time. Nancy went up one walk and down another, listening to the twittering of the birds and now and then the song of a meadowlark. Again, she smelled deeply of the roses and the sweet wisteria which hung over a sagging arbor. 10 minutes later, she returned to the house and sat down on the porch again. Almost at once, a mental image of Nathan Gomber came to her as clearly as if the man had been standing in front of her. The young sleuth's mind began to put together the various pieces of the puzzle regarding him and the railroad property. The very thought the very thoughts frightened Nancy. Leaping up, she decided to ask the police to have Nathan Gomber shadowed. I'll go down to the headquarters and talk to Captain Rosalind, she decided. The cleaning woman is there so she can help Rosemary in case of an accident. Helen was amazed, and here he was acting so worried about your father's safety. When the girls reached police headquarters, they had to wait a few minutes to see Captain Rosalind. Nancy fidgeted under the delay. Every moment seemed doubly precious now. But finally, the girls were ushered inside, and the officer greeted them warmly. Another clue, Miss Drew? He asked with a smile. Nancy told her story quickly. I think you're on the right track, the officer stated. I'll be very glad to get in touch with your Captain McGinnis in River Heights and relay your message. And I'll notify all the men on my force to be on the lookout for this Hannah Gruen. Thank you, Nancy said gratefully. Nancy thanked him, and the girls went on their way. It took every bit of Nancy's stamina not to show her feelings. Her mind would say, we need more canned peas because the ghost took what we had. And at the meat counter, she reflected, Dad loves thick, juicy steaks. Finally, the marketing was finished and the packages stowed in the rear of the convertible. On the way home, Helen asked Nancy what plans she had for pursuing the mystery. To tell the truth, I've been thinking about it continuously, but so far I haven't come up with any new ideas, Nancy answered. When the girls were a little distance from the entrance to the estate, they saw a car suddenly pull out of the driveway and make a right turn. The driver leaned out his window and looked back. He wore a smug grin. Why, it's Nathan Gomber, Nancy cried out. And did you see that smirk on his face? Helen asked. Oh, Nancy, maybe that means he's finally persuaded Miss Flora to sell to him. Yes, Nancy replied grimly. And also, here I've just talked to the police to shadow him, and I'm the first person to see him. With that, Nancy put on speed and shot ahead. As she passed the driveway to the estate, Helen asked, Where are you going? I'm following Nathan Gomber until I catch him. And we will stop there and start with chapter 16 next week, next Sunday, 9 o'clock, same time, same station. Oop, not 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Hello, you look familiar on Facebook. Are you Ray's daughter? No, I am not. I am Eugene's daughter. Sorry about that. Anywho, small world, right? So we will be back. I think I have the next one scheduled for the next chapters for Sunday evening. So I hope you'll join me. Y'all take care. Bye.